Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. As you can tell from my British accent, Jim is not here. He's off doing some other things, so it's going to be me caring or corralling or bullying, depending on how it works, but we're just generally keeping out of the way today. Today's session, we've got 4 people, including myself, and we're going to be talking about Docker, containers, and platforms as a service for development, testing, and deployment. We're going to go for about 2 hours from now, depending on how things go. If we run out of things to talk about, it is a very nebulous subject, so perhaps we won't. But if we have problems, or we just run out of things, or everybody doesn't feel like we're getting any value out of it, then we'll stop a bit less than that. But I have to say, England are playing Denmark today in the European Cup, and despite the fact I'm an American, I really do have to go along and cheer them on. So we will be stopping dead on the 2 hours, no matter what.
You don't have to stop for me, Ian.
Yes. Unfortunately, the Germans aren't in it. England beat them. Okay, so a quick warranty disclaimer before we get to introduce everybody. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed belong solely to the individual panelist and not necessarily to other panelists, their employers, or organisations, committees, or other groups of individuals. I'm going to let you read the rest as well because you don't need me narrating it all. But basically, what we're saying is that this is a general chit chat, and we're not really trying to do this as a form of an official presentation. And if we say something and it turns out to be wrong, we are human beings and we will make mistakes from time to time. So there is no warranty. We're not trying to create one, and there's no liability assumed. Hopefully we won't blow up any rockets on Mars or anything like that by some of the advice we're giving today. It's just a chat. Up and coming TCoffeeAndCode sessions. There are quite a few. We did extend it because it got very, very popular. A lot of people wanted to join in, and it's been pretty successful, really. Wednesday, 14th of July, blockchain and NFT. If you haven't registered yet, you probably don't need to, because I think the registration for this series is an ongoing thing. So once you register once, then you're good to go. After that, you'll get automatic reminders. But if not, then go ahead and register. You can go to the, I think it's Embarcadero main website, or if not, blogs.embarcadero.com, and there's a little link in there to register for TCoffeeAndCode. Just search TCoffeeAndCode and you'll find it. We're going to be talking about some other subjects as well. I'm not going to go into them all, but databases, REST servers, unit testing, that's a very interesting topic to do with test-driven development and stuff like that, and code profiling and a few other things as well. So quite a lot coming up. As I said before, we're not really trying to make this into a presentation heavy thing. It's more of a chat. Let's talk about some of the people on today. The first person up, just in order of the slides that we've got up, is Holger Flick. Holger is the owner and CEO of Flick's Engineering LLC. He's an Embarcadero MVP and a coordinator for the US region. He's also a tech evangelist for TMSsoftware.com. He's the author of multiple Delphi books, including TMS Web Core in English and German. And if you can see the web cameras, which you should be able to do, we've got our web cameras turned on. He's got a new book out as well. Is this new, this book 3? I can't remember. Book 3 is new, right?
Yes, I'm proofreading right now. It should be out next week or the week after that. It's about multi-tier development. And the good thing is today we'll be able to get into that subject to see how Docker can make that even better with Delphi to do multi-tier development.
Excellent. That's $10 commission for each of the other 3. That's good. And you can get to Holger at flicksengineering.com. And I'm going to let Holger say hello and read the rest.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for the invite to Jim and Ian. It's my first coffee talk, and so this is a new experience for me. And if you have questions, just go ahead.
Yeah, there is a questions window, and there's also a chat window amongst ourselves as well. We can get hold of other people if we don't know the answers, but if you've got any questions, go into the questions window and ask away. See, there's a few coming up, but we'll deal with those. We want to try and really stop and answer as many questions as possible, so go ahead. And someone says my accent sounds like a French accent. Okay, the next person up is Olaf Monien. Owner and CEO of Developer Experts LLC, USA. Every time I see this word, Olaf, like,
just for you. Try it with your French accent.
Yes, right, with my French accent. I'm going to say something Monien, Germany.
Yeah.
Actually, Holger could pronounce that word. Isn't that the word you could say, Holger?
Unternehmensberatung.
And that's exactly how I was going to pronounce it, but I thought
that's when my wife always says Gesundheit.
Yes, exactly. He's got offices in Germany and the USA. He's also an Embarcadero MVP. In fact, everybody here today is an Embarcadero MVP. He's coordinator for the DACH region. And he's also a very prolific guy. Every time I see the things he's contributed to, I'm always impressed. He's contributed to Indy, which nearly everybody who uses Delphi nowadays uses Indy. He's also a contributor to Intraweb, quite a big time one as well. And in fact, that's another product that if you've used Delphi for some time, you've probably come across Intraweb. The REST client library and some PAAS components as well. So very useful chat. And if you want to say hi, Monien, Olaf, and I'm just reading your email address.
Yeah. Yeah, hi everybody, and good evening, good afternoon, whatever, wherever you are, and thanks for the great words. And yes, it's Unternehmensberatung Monien, so that's basically a consultancy agency what we have here. So yeah, we go to companies and help them do their development stuff, usually in Delphi, and that's what we do. Yeah. So yeah, I'm excited to join this webinar about Dockers, images, Kubernetes, and platforms, and all the weird words that we will certainly stumble about. So yeah.
Yeah, and we have two German speakers, so we're going to make some very useful explanations. You can say each word, the Kubernetes in German as well. Oh wait, it's the same thing. Yeah. Our next person coming up is Malcolm Groves, who doesn't have a long word that I can't pronounce in his bio. He's principal at Code Partners. He's also an Embarcadero MVP, of course, and he's currently learning to skateboard as a cheap midlife crisis. It's very good. I'm sure he's losing limbs bit by bit by doing that kind of activity. His website is www.code-partners.com, and you can get to him on Twitter at Mal Groves. Hi, Malcolm.
Hey, mate. How are you? I'm feeling a bit inadequate that my screen is so small. Like everyone else had lots more bullet points than I did.
Yeah, but I can read all of yours, and there's a big difference there. Yeah, I'm glad to say that it's an Australian accent, so it's a little bit closer to my accent. I don't feel quite so outnumbered. I think if there was someone like a French person or Spanish, then I would feel very slightly hemmed in by the Europeans. Although, having said that, Holger lives in the US, and yeah, it's all kind of US based, so maybe we outnumber you as well. Well, it's good to see you, and don't worry about your bio. We'll make some stuff up as we go along, and we'll add it in later and show a slide. I have to say, I've actually come across Code Partners several times before and done some presentations, I think, in connection with that as well. Great bunch of people, good code resources, and good consultancy service. So yeah,
cool.
Oh, and that's me, although I'm younger in this photograph because that's the best headshot I've got. I'm a software developer. You've probably seen me on these things before. I think I've been on quite a few of them now, 5 or 6 at least. I get up every morning, even though I'm an MVP, I just write code just like anybody else. I'm a designer, I'm a narrator, I'm a writer. I'm also a poet, a published poet. Done a lot of different things, but I won't make you read or write the poetry. And of course, just like everybody else, I'm an Embarcadero Delphi MVP. Born in London, now I live in Dallas, Texas, in the USA. And I do keep telling everybody the reason I can be so prolific in writing lots and lots of programs and get them out there is because of Delphi. It makes me look good. I'm a mediocre, lazy programmer, and Delphi makes me look like I'm supercharged, so it's good. And you can get to me on my website at about.me/Embarker, or follow me on Twitter. Every time I say this, I get a few more followers. It's @punctuation. Okay, Jim's not here, but we all know who Jim is. Jim, sorry, not here. He's not sick or anything. He's just double booked and doing some other things. But he is Mr. Swipe to Unlock. Every time you get your phone and you swipe to unlock it, it's one of Jim's patents that did that. Apparently, he doesn't get any money for it, so he messed up a little bit there. I think if I'd invented something like that, I'd want to get a dollar every time someone unlocked their screen. But hey, that's the way it works. Okay, so if you can, as we said earlier on, put your questions in the question panel and we'll discuss and or possibly answer them. If I just take a quick whiz down some of the ones we've got for now. Mikhail is saying the PDF web link isn't working.
Yeah, it's something with the Amazon whatever link. I posted the same file through Dropbox in the chat window. So everybody go to the chat window and just take the Dropbox link from there. That one should work.
Okay, that's good. And I'm just gonna write that in. I've got a loud keyboard, I'm sorry, everybody. Handout link is broken, I have the same one, blah, 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 blah. From Poland. Okay, so Poland doesn't want to mention the European soccer either. Okay. What else have we got? Chrome says error response. Oh, so they're really all just saying we can't get the handout. Okay, I understand. Tatiana says that the Dropbox link does work, and that's good.
Yep, that's.
And Kirk also admires Malcolm for his skateboarding. So do I, to be honest. But there you go.
Well, he hasn't seen me, so it's easy to admire it when you don't.
I'd want to be wrapped in bubble wrap if I was doing it. Okay, so really all the questions are all about the Dropbox link, so that's good. We solved the problem ahead of time. Well done, Olaf.
Well, that was short. Well, good night, guys.
Who wants to try and take some of these topics then? Who wants to grasp the nettle of what is a container? Nobody's rushing to answer that question.
Yeah, exactly. It's actually me who wrote down this first question. So, what is a container? What is Docker? What are we actually talking about? So, I guess that's the opener question here. I mean, I guess some of the guys in the attendees room are still thinking, all right, let's see what they have to say, and if this is something I can actually brew in my kitchen or something. So yeah, container, Docker, what is this all about? Well, we all know virtual machines, I guess, or most of us know virtual machines. Some of us are doing Delphi development in virtual machines, and we all know, or those who ever used a virtual machine know, well, you have to install a complete version of an operating system into a virtual machine to get running. So that takes quite a few steps to get a machine or a virtual machine that is fully set up to do something. And we probably, or some of you probably saw, well, links and notes that you could get a ready-to-use virtual machine with some software on it. So this virtual appliance idea, which is behind that, is probably quite a bit older than Docker's idea and the containers that they came up with, because a virtual machine that has some software, an email server, or even Delphi, if you will, on it is large. So we are talking gigabytes. So to get something in a virtual machine is usually several gigabytes to get you going. That basically is something that the guys from Docker or whoever came up with the first idea thought it's something we can probably improve. So they thought, what if we do just a half-baked virtual machine, something where you take parts of the host's operating system and inject it somehow into a container and put just the software that you are going to use in that container as add-on to a file and inject the operating system from the outside in some way, then it might save memory. So technically, a container is something smaller than a virtual machine, but it has similarities. So you can run stuff that is inside a container. And here comes the next word, which is an image. So a container contains an image usually. And you take a container with an image in it, and your operating system is provided by the host, the Docker host in that case. So in easy words, containers or the images inside of a container are small, lightweight virtual machines. And I guess that's the easiest and far most description that you can give for a container. Any complaints? Any add-ons?
No, I think it's
you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Oh.
And sorry, Ian, but I actually can show it like in practice, you know, how this looks. I can share my screen and
sure, let me
basically, okay, give some, and then Olaf can continue by explaining what we see on screen, what the different terms are, because we have the term container, we have the term image, we have the term registry, and the container is actually the last step. If you launch an image, it becomes a container, and it all seems very abstract, and that has kept me from Docker for a good 2 years because I was so afraid of all these terms, you know. And
I'm ready to share your screen when you are, then, Holger.
okay, just the one with the.
Well, you pick. It'll ask you which one you want to pick. So.
Okay, that's good. There we go. And it says show my screen. Let's see if it's the right one.
Yeah, always a good thing.
Is it, which one is it sharing? Because I'm not seeing anything being shown.
You are sharing Rogue One.
Yeah, that's good. That's exactly it. Because I made sure that the background image, the wallpaper image, is not visible because copyright issues, you know. And,
yeah, we know.
So, so this
it's just the background of the Spice Girls. We know.
Yeah. So what we see here is this is pretty what Olaf said. Docker is not an operating system. It is available for Linux. It's available for Windows. But the key is that the initial Docker also for Mac, sorry, but the initial Docker uses a Linux subsystem for the software that you install. But nowadays there's also a Windows subsystem. But with Windows, for example, like, you know, only because Linux and Windows were always totally different things, but Windows now has Linux included. So you can actually install Docker on your Windows system and start right away without any hassle, because you just have to install the Windows subsystem, the Linux subsystem. You can choose the distribution and can start with Docker right away. What you're seeing here is actually inside of a web browser, and that's what makes Docker so powerful, because my my NAS system actually has a Docker software package, so I can start with Docker right away because the NAS is based on Linux. And the first term that you need to be comfortable with is the registry. So there is a registry, a worldwide registry that contains all Docker images. What is an image? So an image is actually a piece of software that you want to install that you need. For example, I said here MySQL. So this is the registry item for a MySQL database server. So you download the image to your system, And then you can choose which version you want. That's a big powerful feature. If a customer of yours has an older version, you can actually pick the version your customer has. Or like me, I want the latest one. And then you select, and then the image is downloaded. I don't know what is the term there, but it becomes local on your system. And as soon as it is completely downloaded, I'm not seeing that right now. Let's see, because it's covered with other stuff here. So here, it's not downloaded completely yet. There you see the size of each of these images. Then you can launch a container. What else do you see here? For example, I have this one here is a proxy, a web server proxy, Nginx proxy. I have a MariaDB image downloaded. So the latest one here, it's 500 megabytes, and then you can launch it. And you can configure the image, and as soon as you do that, it becomes a container. And the container, as Olaf just explained, is the running piece of software on, so you can use the software in association with your own. And now the key point that you, where it becomes really useful, you can create your own images to test your own software, for example. So let's say you have
Holger, sorry to interrupt you. Any chance you can make your screen a little bit bigger? Maybe the browser there, if it will support it.
Oh yeah, wait, let me.
Yeah, someone's saying it's a bit small. You can do, if it's in the web browser person, you can just do Control+.
You probably just can hit Control+ or something, which should do the trick.
So, but this is better now, isn't it?
Yeah, that's better. That's a lot better. Thanks.
I
so, Holger, just hold on for a second. So what you're saying is there is a registry, a public registry like Get or like a Nugget for Microsoft stuff. So where I can basically get all these software packages that I would have to install manually usually, right?
Yes. So if I have a customer, for example, that has a database, a MySQL database, I just get from the registry, I get the MySQL that I need, and the server is started the moment I click launch. That literally launches in this case, if I download the MySQL image, it launches a MySQL server. And then you might wonder, Olaf, is there any way to configure it? And that's what's coming up next.
So if my customer says, to do the project, we actually need MongoDB. So usually I would dig into wherever GitHub and try to compile and construct some Mongo instance. So what you're saying is I just type in Mongo and it would find something there. Okay.
Yes, which it just did.
So this is all pre-configured and ready to use. I don't have to do all the magic stuff, which usually starts with compile your own Linux kernel. So it just works, right?
It is actually, the MongoDB is one of the favorite projects that they have on the repository, the Docker registry. So they've got Nginx, Apache, some other stuff, but MongoDB, MySQL, and all of the most popular. Pick a name that everybody knows, and it's probably one of the favorite packages there. Mongo is a pain to configure.
What's also really important is, and I only said this as a side note, but that's really important to note. There's like official images which are deployed by the creator of the software. For example, the Mongo package is the official image. But let's say Olaf is active in the Mongo community building databases of some sort, and he thinks his configuration is better than the official one. He could do a Mongo developer experts and also add it to the registry so that everybody could use his image instead of the official one. So that is also a fact that makes Docker very powerful.
So if in your book there was a web application that requires some database backend, you could just go and download the configuration that you prepared for all the readers of your book. So if you created a MongoDB or a SQLite or whatever DB dash Flick's engineering or Holger's book, then you could actually provide all the ready-to-use packages that your examples in the book would require, right?
Yes, and I could also bundle the databases with it, as long as it's license-wise possible. Yes, I could. The thing that I do when I show web applications to customers, for example, the thing is that you need a web server in order to honestly run a web application. You're no longer just showing a bunch of HTML pages like back in the day. So I download the Nginx, that is the official, that is a web server, and the Nginx then can be customized, which we haven't talked about yet, but I also have a concrete example for that. But the Nginx then is the web server, and you can supply your application when you launch the image, and then you literally have a running web application that you can access from your browser without having any servers installed. It's just on one machine. That's what's getting a little bit confusing in the beginning, but with ports, that's of course possible. And even if your port 80 is free on the machine that you're running on, you can use that for a web server.
Just on that, there's a couple of questions that have come up about security around this, and it's a totally reasonable point that I'm trusting this image that I'm downloading and I'm running it locally. And I think one of the important, I mean, the short answer is yes, you are. But I think one of the important points to make is if you, on your registry, like there's a number of different registries you can use, but for example, on Docker Hub, which is probably the biggest one. On Docker Hub, all images are built from a Docker file. It's a text file which is basically lays out the image that it's inheriting from. So for example, it might be inheriting from thank you. So this Docker file that's on the screen at the moment, we can see it's inheriting from this image called Nginx. And then it's only doing the one thing, it's copying some files from this HTML directory into the image. But all of the images that you get, even that Nginx one, you could go up to Docker Hub and have a look and see the Docker file it's based on. So you can, it's like open source, I guess, although not as bad. You can go and look at the source code for these images and see exactly what's contained in them and how they've been built. But ultimately, yes, you are trusting them. And going back to the earlier point about VMs versus containers, you know, yes, containers tend to start faster. Yes, they consume less resources. There's a bunch of wonderful things about containers, but one of the continuing points that you have to take into account is security, because containers do run with elevated privileges locally. So you do have to be conscious of what's going on inside those images.
Mm-hmm. And maybe one other question that Alf asked is, again, security, is it popular to crack other computers from images, I guess is what he is afraid of. I mean, it's like you said, it's like an open source system. You can basically do little inspection of what you're actually getting. And technically, every piece of software can be mis or abused. We've seen reports in the last couple of weeks where they caught open source developers who committed code to Git or through Git into the Linux kernel. And it took quite a while to figure out that this code was actually only meant to be a backdoor system into the Linux kernel. So even in Linux, you are running into those issues. It's all about trust and trust levels. And Holger had the registry open where there was a batch for the official builds. Those are certainly the most trustful images that you would load. So yes, security always check what you are eating. So if it smells, don't use it. It's or don't eat it. It's the same thing here. And
Yeah.
And what Malcolm just said with the high privilege, that is, I'm new to Docker, so I don't know if it was any different like a year ago, but nowadays you can run them without elevated privileges.
You can.
It has become.
There's kind of, it's a transition. For a long time you couldn't, now you can. And so some images, like some have come across and work effectively with normal privileges. Some still require elevated privileges, but I think there's quite a concerted effort in the container community to default to not requiring elevated privileges, because it's a common sort of criticism.
Yeah.
I think the other thing about it is that, Olaf mentioned, the exploits in the Linux kernel. I'm very comfortable sitting down and reading through most Docker files. You're not talking millions of lines of code. You might be talking, even in a really big case, a couple of thousand, and that would be a particularly big one. Most of them are dozens or maybe hundreds for big ones. I'm comfortable sitting down and reading through and establishing whether there's anything that I'm a bit suspicious of in there. I'm never going to sit down and read the Linux kernel source code. So this is inspectable, whereas to me the Linux source code's not. That's just trust.
Or the Windows source code as well, or indeed
my source code half the time.
This is the thing. Someone was saying that they could put up a bad image that might have some viruses and stuff like that. Well, they can, but also if you look at some of these downloads, they have hundreds of thousands of downloads. And the weird thing is that if it's been around for long enough, like a couple of months or something like that, these images really, it's the wisdom of crowds and the safety of large numbers, because if there is something particularly wrong with that image, very quickly it gets spotted, because it tends to be used for development. A lot of the images are used as development environments or development test environments. So initially they tend to be used by people who have actually got more expertise than, say, an end user who wouldn't spot a problem until it was too late. But not only that, if they've used long enough, if something bad is happening, it very quickly gets pulled from that registry, and people say, "I'm not using this." It's like Amazon. Amazon reviews, you can fake them, and you can pay people to give everything 5 stars, but sooner or later there will be enough poor reviews on there for a product that you just go, you know what? No, I'm not going to have your alligator skin handbag that turns out to be this big and is a photograph instead. So it's how these things work. So it's good.
That's a very specific example.
Not that I've ever ordered an alligator skin handbag, but there you go. Holger could probably pick one up down by the local bayou or river or whatever you call it.
Yeah, there are 2 remarks to what I've shown, because there have been questions about Synology. So just so you guys are sure, I use this because I have this here in my home, and the reason is it was bundled, but a lot of people are already mentioning they bought a new Synology system and it's no longer available. So I never wanted to say, hey, Synology is the solution to do. When you want to use Docker, you can install it in Windows. The advantage is, why I've shown this, is it is very visual. If you do this in Windows, for most of the operations, you have to use the command line in the terminal or in the PowerShell. So this is very visual to see what Docker can do. Obviously, in order to check out, as it is called, an image from the registry, you would have to use the command line. To launch a Docker image, you would use the command line. And all these different tabs here would also be specified on the command line, or as Malcolm said, there is like certain configuration files that you can use instead as well. But this is for us here, a very visual approach to show you what Docker can do. And there is no intention from us saying, hey, go buy out and buy product X, because it is going to support Docker for the time being. We don't know that. I don't know that.
The GUI is basically driving the command line to make it easier, because the command line is the one thing that really, I'm an experienced developer. I've been doing it 38 years. I started out in Unix. I started out with COBOL and things like that. So I'm used to command lines. I like them. I have WSL2 running on my machine. First thing I install when I get a new PC is install Ubuntu on the Windows WSL. So I'm fairly confident with the command line, but wow, Docker, it's got some real mind-bending strings of text to type in if you do things manually. The actual config files aren't too difficult, but as soon as you go beyond the just, let's get this image and make it a copy and run, it starts to get tricky. So the GUI helps, and being a Windows programmer, I'm more comfortable with having a GUI because I can see visually what's going on rather than work out, was it -v -p 8081 colon,
exactly.
I mean, you always end up with the help screen next to you of the command line and going, oh wait, it's -vx or something like that. So the other, sorry, question someone did ask, and I don't know whether you guys can answer this, is what is the easiest way to distribute a private Docker image to a Docker host of a client?
We can literally go there next, because we should launch the container, and then Malcolm gave you the reply, the Docker file that you basically use to create your own image in a way. Then your own computer has a registry of itself, and then you can use that to bundle it as your own image and carry that from computer to computer and install it there, for example.
I think they're talking about in a commercial sense, how would you make it available for, let's give an example of the kind of people I work for. We have a bunch of companies, for example, that have got a time and attendance system. And one of them, we don't use Docker to containerize, but we use a kind of ready rolled VMware image. But we wouldn't necessarily want that image to be sitting on some developer's PC or something like that. We would want a staging area, and that staging area would be available to the customer, as a kind of resource that we could send them an email and say, well, go to here and click on this, and it'll install it for you. Or more likely, our end user installation techs would click on a link, and then it would install on their server, and we help them configure it that way. We don't use Docker for that reason, because it's complicated to set up in the broad range of customers that we have. Whereas for the cloud thing, where it's a VMware image, we just literally run, and up pops a new VMware image. It's ready to go. We don't have to do anything with it. But in comparison to Docker, it's a very fat solution. Docker is much more lean, I think is the word I'm looking for, and much more self-contained and very specific. Docker is really containerizing one or two apps rather than everything in a big bundle, and you have to have your app installed in it. So the VMware images, in comparison to Docker, tend to be a whole operating system with your apps running in it. The container is really just making that app work. We've got some links coming up later for those that are with us still, and there's quite a lot of people watching. We've got some, it's not all going to be about Docker. We've got some other alternatives as well, because Docker's very good at solving specific scenarios. It is kind of leaning heavily towards Linux and Linux kind of hosted applications. Some of the technology we're going to talk about later is more really, well, Malcolm disagrees. Yeah, come on, let's go for it. Yeah. But that's my opinion. You can tell me why you disagree. But in a moment, we're going to talk about some other much more generic operating system solutions, shall we say, for streaming apps and for containerizing apps that aren't necessarily Docker. What's your disagreement, Malcolm? I don't have a problem. I'm waiting to be convinced.
Sorry, no. Before we have an argument, just on your original point about how do you distribute this to people. I mean, if if this is, so the first question, I guess, is does the Docker image need to be down with your end customer, or is that a server that you're running somewhere? Yep. So obviously, if you're running the server and they're just connecting to it, that's doesn't matter. But if you actually need to get the image down onto your customer site or something like that, we've been talking about these container registries as being these public things, but you can totally have both private registries that, like for example, Code Partners have a private registry that our customers are able to get access to, and different images are made available to different clients depending on what we're doing for them. And then some of them are internal only to Code Partners. So you can kind of have your own registry as well as the access to the public ones. And so often that's the easiest way. Down on the customer site, we might just run the commands. And I'm not normally a command line guy, but the Docker ones I think are not too bad. Maybe I just like minus V's and colons and that kind of thing. But yeah, you can just run the command to pull the image, and once you configure it, it can go to the private registry first, and then if the image isn't available through there, it can kind of pull through from the public registry. So really, this is pretty flexible, but like anything, there's an investment in learning how it works first. You can't just walk in and go, I've tried it for 10 minutes and it's not working, so this is rubbish. Now, do you want to have our argument about this being Linux?
Well, no. We're not disagreeing on the principle. I think oh God, an Australian, yeah, and a Brit. There you go. Yeah. Oh no, they didn't go yesterday. No, I mean the principle. The principle really is as you say, what's your usage scenario? What is it you're trying to do with this? Why do you want to use Docker? Is the question. Why do you want to containerize the app, or why do you want to containerize a collection of apps as a kind of deliverable to your customer? And what is it that your customer's primary operating system is going to be, and what environment is that operating system? Because if you're talking about a bunch of people that are using Linux all the while, then I think that in my experience, they're more open to strange systems being put on their computers. For some reason, Windows admins are very resistant to all sorts of things being put on, and the minute you start saying Docker, they'll start twitching and going crazy and say, well, why can't we use some kind of VMware solution? Because that obviously was well, and probably still is the primary virtualization technology that people are used to. Even if you start talking about some other forms of virtualization, they might do Hyper-V or things like that, and most of them don't even realize that actually they're running virtualization every time they open a command prompt, because the command prompt it's not DOS. When you go into Windows and you open a command prompt, that is a virtualized environment. WSL2, Windows System for Linux 2, also virtualized, and basically it is almost like a Docker container that is Docker to the max, except it's more like a virtual machine. But I think Docker.
I think some of we used to see the resistance in the amongst the Windows sort of camp, Windows admins a while ago. I think I've seen it a lot less once Microsoft rolled container support. It's compatible with Docker. They worked pretty closely with Docker to make it compatible, but it's Microsoft's containers. They rolled that into Server 2016 and some particular version of Windows 10, but it was quite a while ago. And once it kind of became blessed by Microsoft, I think some of those things went away. Once some of these larger companies could send their guys off on and get certified on Windows containers, then suddenly there were no security vulnerabilities because they had a certification, and we were all good. So we were able to use it.
I think what happened, I don't have any secret knowledge about it, but I think partly what happened was that Microsoft looked at the idea of containerization, but actually app streaming, because I think when they were talking about their Windows 10X and it was going to, I think their secret idea was to make all PCs effectively dumb terminals like they used to be back in the days of, you know, time sharing Unix. And the idea would be that your operating system would exist in the cloud. Your desktop would be in the cloud, and in fact, there have plenty of solutions out there for that. And I think that 10X was going to be the initial, you know, foray into that for the consumers. And then they realized that actually it was going to be a big problem. And now we're looking at Windows 11, which is the most connected Windows ever, as they keep saying. And I don't disagree that it's connected, but I think it's no more connected than Windows 10 as far as I can see. Yeah, it's got some live tile type things that are now in their little widgets and stuff like that. But really, so far, the Windows 11 preview that we see is not an awful lot different from Windows 10. So commercial customers are much slower to adopt new technologies when it comes to the desktop. They just want the desktop to work. They want it to run the apps that they've got. But I think that, you know, in the coming years, with the massive uptake of people with fiber optic connections to the premises, fiber to the cabinet, the broader availability of the internet in premises at a speed that is usable, it means that the concept of having, you know, everything running in the cloud becomes more viable. And that, of course, then means that, you know, Azure and, you know, Amazon's solutions take on a lot more relevance in terms of streaming the desktop down, streaming the apps, virtualizing the apps. You never install the app, it just appears on your machine. And I think that, you know, there is a good reason why Jeff Bezos, his guy that's taken over from him, was the guy that was in charge of all of the Amazon AWS services. You know, they accidentally became the big cloud providers, and of course they've got all sorts of solutions for running apps in the cloud and virtualizing desktops, which is their big thing that they're publishing at the moment. Same with Microsoft, and Apple are not in that game at the moment.
Maybe
so
one more.
What's going to happen? You know, is this going to be a problem for Apple maybe in the future? Have they got a secret, you know, cloud-based solution coming up? Because these containers solve a problem, because the operating systems tend to be, you know, fat clients sitting in your office or your home, and you want to have stuff running on that machine or running in a server without it affecting the rest of the server. You want to spin up some kind of service. Oh yeah, well, you can just run a container and up comes your Nginx server, up comes your MongoDB server, and you don't have to spend hours ruining your server installing lots of stuff in the background.
Yeah, maybe going back to security, maybe Malcolm also, because you have big customers that use it, we haven't said so far when you launch a container to which resources the container has access to. I think that's something we haven't looked at yet. And if you look at the tabs here, you can literally map local folders from your system to the Docker container. So if the Docker container is Linux based, it has a Linux file structure, and you can map that to your local system. And that's what you, for example, do if you have a web server like Nginx. Then you can mount a folder with your web application that resides on the Windows machine to make that your root folder of the web server. Or if you launch MySQL, you can specify the folder where all your databases are. The databases are actually on your Windows system, but the container has access to them. So that's point number one, security-wise. And point number two is network. So literally, the bridge means the container uses the same network as your local computer. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's it. And you can create separate networks that are just being used by the container. And then you map ports. Like if you have here, this is why I like this user interface so much. It populates everything, what you need to configure. So the web server obviously by default has port 80, and the local port is set to auto, which means that the Docker that you use to launch the container determines the port. Mostly that means it's going to be 80 as well, but you could literally say, okay, launch this on 8085, and then you have a web server running on port 8085. If you choose bridged, then it's going to be the same network as your host. And the third one is environment variables, meaning you configure how the web server behaves using certain variables. And same for the database server. For example, you would specify the port that the database server reacts to, sometimes in an environment variable, like Malcolm provided the Docker container for the PA server, and you use the environment variables to specify which port is used for the PA server for Red Studio, for example. So there's different approaches to configure the container. And finally, where do you find all that? If you go to Docker Hub and go to, for example, one of these images here, you see the Nginx image, you get a quick reference and a detailed documentation. And what you see if you go, for example, to the Docker Compose, which is the formal term for a configuration file, if you launch a container or multiple containers, because we haven't said that you can combine containers. For example, that you have a web server plus a database server, you can combine them. Then you can specify the volumes, how they are assigned, which ports are used. For example, here you say, I want to use port 8080 on my machine for port 80 in the Docker container. And this is how you set the environment variables. For example, here you set the root domain name for the web server. So, and you also specify the Nginx port for the web server inside of the container like this. So the documentation is key here because each container uses a different configuration approach. Some use environmental variables, some use other things. So that is something you have to look at. Also, what you get is a documentation. Each web server, of course, needs content like the root directory, and you can specify that as well. And as Malcolm just said, you can also say, hey, copy these files from the local machine into the container when you launch it, so you don't have this security risk that the container accesses files on your machine. But maybe, Malcolm, you can enlighten us a little bit more how you do it with bigger customers, how they do it. Like, do they map or do they create containers that contain everything?
Well, I think you raise a really good point back on the security thing before I talk about that. You control what the container has access to. So you decide, okay, I'm going to give it access to these parts of my host operating system, the file system, and these parts of the network and all the rest of it. So you're in control of that. And like your example then, I think is a really good example of how to get started with this. Like we sometimes get contacted by people who say, okay, we want to Dockerize, our application, and they don't even really know what that means yet, but their boss walked in after lunch and said, oh, Docker's the thing, so we got to do it. I usually tell them, well, don't. So don't even think about doing that yet. What you want to start with is using Docker in your development environment. Don't forget about production for now. And one of the simplest places to start with is, for example, a web server or maybe a database server. One of our customers, their support guys, they've got a traditional Delphi client server application, Delphi rich desktop app talking back to database backend, 2 tiers. And I can't remember, but let's say they were on MySQL. I can't remember what it was a while ago now. But they have clients who, some are using this version of MySQL, some are using this other version of MySQL, and their support group goes nuts having to find the right, set up VMs and find the right VMs that have got the right combination of what version of their Delphi app and what version of MySQL to test and try and reproduce what their customers are seeing. Docker massively simplifies that, because, you know, with a few commands that we put in a script for them, so they don't even really have to know, they can say, all right, start, you know, pull down the MySQL version X image and automatically pull in our database structure, or map it to a place on the drive where we've already got our MySQL image. So the MySQL image lives on the host drive, and the MySQL database file lives on the host drive, and the MySQL server is running in Docker. Yeah. And so within seconds, they can go, right, let's test this combination of database versions. Okay, get off the phone with those guys, shut it down, it's gone. Next customer rings up, it's a different version, bang, 10 seconds later, they've got that version of MySQL running, and they can test their application against it. You know, that doesn't touch production.
With the databases, that's the key point, because they can copy the databases into the container inside of the script. I mean, that has to be really, really sad. Like, because I also had a customer that has like a Firebird database in different versions, and with Docker, it's literally launching the different versions, and then you can do a backup with a different version of the database, and all these operations are literally just a keystroke on the command line. Sorry.
Yeah. No, but that's exactly it. And that doesn't touch production. That's not scary in terms of customer downtime. It's all internal. But really quickly, we saw both the dev team and the support team get comfortable with Docker, and they get their heads around it. Yeah. And then, you know, after a few months of doing that, then we don't even have to push them. They start to get ambitious about, oh, well, hang on, maybe we can do this in our application, and maybe, you know, so really start small. Start, if you're playing with web development, yeah, don't install a web server locally. Take the extra hour or two of research that it takes to learn how to set up a web server in Docker and map it to a local drive, so you can be editing your HTML or JavaScript or whatever locally, and you can just spin up Apache or Nginx in a Docker container. Yeah. Yeah, it's an hour or two more than it would have taken before, but not only will you be learning about web development, but you'll be getting comfortable with Docker. Yeah.
And another key thing is the combination of multiple containers, or the combination of multiple. That is something that has to be emphasized as well. You can combine your web server with a database server, and you have a running system for your web application with that database server in with a snap of a finger. And as also people are commenting, I'm just saying the questions flow by. There is also Docker images for Docker maintenance. It sounds crazy, but like there's tools available to make it all easier.
Yeah.
Cortana,
and
for example.
So one of the key things to take with you is you separate data and the actual applications, so that you just can run any version of the application. And if you separated the data well, then you just let it run on this very same data that you already had, like database files or backups or your root www root directory, whatever you have. Okay. And there's one question in the chat room here. It appears that there was a confusion in the very beginning when Holger said, "Oh, I'm running this on my NAS device, which is a Synology." And I had a discussion going on here that only certain Synologies are supported, and another user said, "Oh, it runs fine on QNAP devices." Don't get what Holger wrong. He runs several images on his Synology because he can run them there. He runs a firewall or something like that. It's a small application, and NAS devices usually have smaller CPUs. If you want real computing power, of course, you run it on a dedicated server, a server which has, of course, Docker installed as a as the master software, if you will. So you can even run or use Docker places in the cloud, Amazon and whoever provides ready to use Docker instances, so where you can actually upload or download depends on the perspective, images and let them run in the cloud on hardware that Amazon provides. So you completely free, and you have to decide what computing power you need, how many instances you need, and you basically have a huge Lego system. You plug and play and put your system together, basically, right? And
I think that's one of the key things as well. Is you know, I mean, this is why they call them containers. I mean, just like shipping, the container has become really quickly kind of the standard unit of computing, or cloud computing, certainly. You know, we can run the same Docker image on Holger's NAS in his, I don't know where it is, in his bedroom or lounge room or wherever it is, and run that same image on, you know, Amazon or Google or Azure or DigitalOcean or pretty much any now cloud computing facility. Their sort of standard unit that they work in almost is a Docker container. Yeah. So,
and the reason why, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just want to say the reason why it is on the Synology is the Synology, if you ever tried, I'm not a network specific guy, so if you ever try to run your own name server on Linux, it's like, I don't know what I'm doing with all the configuration files. So what I did, I downloaded one of those containers. It's called Pi-hole. Or initially it was like, you can also run it on a Raspberry Pi. That's where it comes from, because a lot of people buy a Raspberry Pi, connect it directly to their router. And on the Raspberry Pi, that's how little these images can be, or containers. You install the Pi-hole, which then is a name server that filters your internet requests for privacy. So you do not see any advertisement, everything is being filtered. And that's why the Synology makes perfect sense, because that's my gateway to the outside world whenever, and also I use it to basically, when I'm outside at customers, I can access that thing and I want it to be on all the time. My computers aren't on all the time, so that's why it's on that server for me. But in a big company,
one of my customers uses Pi-hole to actually get rid of all of the advertising spam. They actually use it on Hyper-V as it happens, but it's stuck at the entrance to the internet, so to speak. It sits there, it's a name server for the internet, and filters out all the dodgy domains. I mean, they have Malwarebytes cloud on there anyway, which solves a lot of those problems, but it also filters out a whole ton of advertising links at source. So never mind having a browser component to actually filter that out. It will actually filter it out at source. And here's Jim. Jim's joined us. You're muted, Jim. You should know better by now.
I muted myself. Okay, there we go. I'm back. Yep, it never fails. It seems like no matter how much I do this, I still keep making all the rookie mistakes.
Yeah, that's the way it goes. Well, we've talked a lot about Docker. That's what you've missed, is really Docker is the solution for lots of people's problems and things like that. We do have some other screens with links on and things like that. So maybe in the second hour or second 50 minutes, because I really am going at the time that the soccer starts, so that I can watch England beat Denmark horribly and get into the final of the European Cup. But there are some other topics that we got there. So we had we talked about Docker. There are some specialized kind of containerization things like HHVM, which is a Facebook originated form of containerization. It stands for Hip Hop Virtual Machine. I don't quite what they were on when they wrote that, but yes, that's what it's about. And it's really specific. It actually is for the Hack programming language. I just really wanted to include that so that people can go and see what it does, because it is actually pretty interesting. Hack is a strongly typed version of PHP. So it's just one of the things that you like, why did they do that? But it's a very, very efficient form of containerization. If you've got PHP apps, it will run on it. and it's ready to go. You download a hip hop virtual machine, run it, and it's ready to run. It's just a bizarre kind of thing.
Ian, you've clearly never written PHP if you had to ask why they would build a strongly typed version of PHP.
Yeah, I have, which is why I know about hip hop virtual machines. Oh, I don't even get me started on the horrors of PHP. I mean, PHP for Delphi did exist, and I did use it for a while. But PHP, yes, usually maintaining other people's PHP projects is usually the point where the rest of my hair falls out. I think it's already happened over the years, having to write C programs.
PHP, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, low blow.
Vagrant is another technology.
For obvious reasons.
Yeah, exactly. Vagrant is another technology. It's got an interesting name. It's designed to be a very fast spin-up virtualization technology. Go to vagrantup.com. Pretty much the same as Docker, that they're ready-made containers. It's kind of a competing technology, but uses the same ideas. You type in
Vagrant is different, and isn't Vagrant that it uses like actual virtual machine technology behind the scenes, right? So use Vagrant, it will use like VMware or Parallel or VirtualBox and spin up virtual machines. Yeah, whereas Docker is lighter weight and it doesn't actually have the full virtual machine. Is that right?
Well, Docker on Windows actually uses Hyper-V, I think, in the background. But in fact, there's a couple of bugs that I found to do with it where if you're running Docker and you've got some virtualization going on, it can be a bit of a clash, because that's what happened to me. Well, Holger's nodding as well, and so is Malcolm. So it wasn't just me. I thought it was just me, but I found that I got some weird issues. And weirdly enough, Microsoft Edge just closed on me one time, and it was in connection with Docker. So I'm not quite sure why that happened. I did do a virus check just in case, but yes, I mean, they are different technologies. Really, for me, Docker was better than Vagrant. It's more complicated to understand because Vagrant is really dead simple. But actually, once you get your head around Docker, Docker's straightforward as well. It's not that difficult. For anybody who's coding, it should be,
that's the key.
Second nature to look at weird command lines, work out the ones you really need to know, and ignore all the other options that you're never going to care about, and just have your little notes that say, type this in, put this in the config file, and off you go. It works. But unless you're doing something more there.
And quite important, there are multiple UI front ends for Docker. So there is Portainer, there is some Kite something software. You just choose what you like. So and even those UIs are available as image, of course. So you just get your first thing running, you get the very simple Docker UI interface, and just download an image and get a more complex, more capable UI if you like. So it's quite easy to use. And I have one more here, one question which clearly shows that we are in a Delphi community. Is Firebird available?
I'll look that
up. I mean, I think Malcolm mentioned Firebird already.
In fact, that's actually a good question, because there's another one now that we've got Jim on the hook, so to speak, and he can be the unofficial answer to this. A couple of people in the question said, is Delphi or RAD Studio available as a Docker image? And to which I've already said, no, it's not. And certainly, I'm not aware of an official image working like that. And there are, as far as I'm aware, technical reasons why that won't work anyway. And the other one is, I think RAD Server. Am I right in saying RAD Server is available as a Docker image? Yeah. So Delphi, no. RAD Server, yes. Jim, have you got anything to say about that? And by the way, Jim, welcome back. So you can take over. In charge.
So we do have, actually, if you go to the slides that are in the handout section or in the link Olaf put in, at the end, there are some links to the, we do have some DocWiki images or DocWiki links and more details on the, we have 4 official Embarcadero Docker images. We have one that is PA server, one that is PA server with interbase, and then RAD server, and I can't remember what the 4th one is, but there's 4 that are maintained by us that have interface and PA server and RAD server set up in them already, and then documentation on how to use those with Docker. Now, Malcolm, I'm going to ask you, or maybe one of the others can chime in on, I know you can do GUI with Docker and there is Windows Docker containers, but does it make sense to have a GUI, an IDE in a Docker image?
Well, okay, so personal opinion time, but as if all the rest of this hasn't been personal opinion, but no, to give you the short answer, no, it doesn't make any sense. Containers aren't really about GUI apps. You know, you saw before when Holger was showing stuff, you can expose network ports. Yep. So if your GUI is in a web browser, then no problem, that's fine. But if you're talking about a rich GUI like we all know through Delphi, probably doesn't make sense. There's various ways that you can convince a container to expose a GUI, you know, and they all vary in levels of smelly hackery. You know, people will try and launch an RDP session, you know, have an RDP server running inside their Windows container, or well, actually, in the Linux world, there's a little less smelly hackery involved. It's okay, like, you know, because you can also do the what's it called, broadcast D or something inside a container and access your GUI through a browser. But it's all that kind of stuff. It's all, how can I get my GUI out through a network port? Yeah. If you want a GUI, like an interactive GUI without all of that sort of mucking around, that's really where, and you don't want to use a VM for some reason, that's really where the app virtualization and app streaming sort of stuff comes in. You know, it's possible, none of it's nice, and I can't imagine trying to run a complex set of multiple tools like Delphi inside a container. Like I can't imagine running Notepad in a container. Most of the examples of getting a GUI working are something simple like Notepad. Something like Delphi with a debugger and hooks into the operating system, don't waste your time.
I guess we have to realize Docker has its roots in Linux, and Linux is strong in backend technology. That's why we are focusing on Linux and backends, I guess. I think we are safe to say Docker is not really that popular in the Windows world. So running Windows backends is possible, but I would say almost nobody does it. I may get bashed for that, but I think it's the reality. It may change, of course.
Certainly compared to Linux, you're right. The like we've got customers doing it, but it's the minority. You know, I don't know, maybe 5%, 3%.
But even if you download the Microsoft SQL Server, which is also available as a container, it is
which is Linux.
Which is not the Windows, it's the Linux version of the Microsoft SQL Server. And coming back to what Olaf said, if I try to run that on my Synology, well, that's not going to be very performing well. You know, it's like, that is like a full-blown Microsoft SQL Server. But again, everybody who's done a install of the Microsoft SQL Server lately, with all the dialogues, all the configurations, you get the standard installation. If you download the container, you get like a very good documentation from Microsoft, which environment variables to figure out. You literally also configure like the SA user with the password and all that sort of stuff. Then you map your databases in there, and then you can select the version that you want. I mean, it's literally building the script once, and then within minutes you have all the different versions, and there are plenty of Microsoft SQL Server. Remember, there's also the, they're not calling it community, they're calling it Express, the Express versions. So you can literally set the licensing with a key as well. So you see literally what your customers have with their license. So that's so valuable to have. But as Olaf said, it's Linux, it's not Windows.
And you still have to apply all the magic that it would run fast. I mean, running a solid database server like Oracle or Microsoft SQL Server or whatever always requires you to think about how to connect your databases. So you have to set up the machine in a way that the actual software can access the database files in a well, fast manner, if you will. So that kind of magic is not taken away from you.
That being said, I am looking at what would be involved in making a Delphi build server Docker image. There's one problem with that is that the license, the Delphi compiler is not freely redistributable. So we can't post that up on Docker Hub, but I'm looking at a way if maybe I can make a script that somebody can use that could convert, you could install Delphi with your license and then use that to convert it into a Docker image that you can then use yourself for having a Docker build image. But that's a ways off and probably won't be an official Embarcadero offering, as it were, but it'll be what Jim hacked together over the weekend type thing.
Couldn't you convince your PM to recompile the compiler under Linux?
So I actually, I do want to do that, but I did some experiments and the compiler works beautifully under Wine, but the version of MS Build we're using does not work on Linux under Wine. Now, there are other versions of MS Build that do work on Linux natively. Yeah, so there's other versions of MS Build that do work natively on Linux, but I just need to find the version of MS Build that's compatible with the version we're using that also works under Linux. Once we find that, then we'll have the ability to have a full Linux deployment build machine. But until then, that's the limitation.
Okay.
Eventually, I think eventually we'll get there.
Yeah.
There is one question, maybe it's again about GUI and service level. This is Christopher asking, I'd love to get into the differences between the GUI and the service level containers. Well, it's like Malcolm, I think, already explained. GUI in terms of a web server serving web pages, that's easy. And it's what Docker is made for, if you will. But running Linux desktops through Docker is possible, but nobody does it. It's just not what Docker is for. So it would really not be useful, actually, because you would have to run Docker on the desktops. So on the desktop machines that your clients, your employees have to use. So that's not a setup we are looking into, actually. So it's just a different concept we are following here, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right. But I think just to follow that, people shouldn't let that put them off. There's still heaps of value in Docker, even if you're not a web developer, and even if you're not a JavaScript guy or whatever, a web guy. Even just for running your databases and for example, like we talked about databases, the other thing that we use it for is running unit tests and tests on different platforms. So running up our unit tests on particular versions of Windows under Windows containers or particular versions of Linux, that kind of stuff, being able to spin up different databases and run our tests against those. Heaps of value in that. Yeah. So I sometimes see Delphi guys go, oh, I build GUI apps. I can't put a GUI app in a Docker container. Okay, that's the end of my Docker explorations. It definitely shouldn't be. There's still heaps of value you can get out of it with surprisingly little effort.
I think the key thing really is the idea of taking server apps and the back end mechanics of your application infrastructure, shall we say, containerizing it and having it repeatable. But not only that, I mean, personally, I would like to see containerization of RAD Studio in the sense that it has all the components in there that I need in the way I want it. I could do this with a virtual machine, but it would be a lot cooler if when there was a RAD Studio version came out, I could go update to the latest version of RAD Studio and everything magically works. But hey, you know, it's a long way off, shall we say. But for us, the containerization of the back end of it is actually a big deal because you know, we are wanting to make sure that we've got a repeatable environment amongst our customers for the back end. So we want a specific way that MySQL is set up to be secure, that it is not, you know, lots of people can install MySQL and out of the box it's reasonably secure. But if you're talking about a cloud environment where people are actually able to hammer that server, you know, we had a system last week that someone tried to hack, you know, non-stop for an hour trying to break into various logins, and he was a bit amateur because, you know, we just watched him for the fun of it to see how he's going to get along and see what he would try so that we could, you know, in case there was a new technique we didn't know about, but because we could just shut him off straight away. But it means that with containerization, you can develop that MySQL protection or SQL Server or whatever other technology you're protecting, get that right. Produce your own container. It's just got those things in it and nothing else to do with the operating system, nothing to do with Windows updates, nothing to do with Linux updates. That container runs, and then you know when you deploy that, it's secure. It's going to work. It's going to be repeatable. Your guys are not going, you know, your IT people are not going to connect to it and go, whoa, wait a minute, who set this up? Where's that password? Where's this? Where's that? It's all in one image, and that's the value of containerization for commercial, you know, environments that are delivered to end customers. It also means that it makes it a nice little black box because it means I'm not having to go to the customer and say, we would like to go on your machine and install MySQL, a version of PHP, Python, or whatever else that is making the back end plumbing work. We just say, here's your box, here's what it exposes on these ports, and you don't have to worry about what it's doing internally because you can't access your server. It's just, you know, it's an in and an out. It's an in and out for the services. You don't care if it's doing anything else as long as it can't get through those ports. All it provides is a MySQL connection or something else. Then that's what it's for.
We got a good question here also about the lifetime of a container. I think that's a really good question. We haven't figured that out yet. So if you launch a container and run it, it runs until your machine stops. And there's also parameters what happens if your machine starts up again. There's like an auto start, like for services, that it restarts. And yes, the you can think of your container, as we said, like having its own file structure and networking. So if the container, for example, is a MySQL server and it has like configuration files and all that kind of stuff, it is being persisted. And you can even, with some containers, you can map the directories where the configuration files are stored to your own local machine. So if you change the container, for example, you can't update the version like that. So you have to basically dump the container and get the next release from the registry or whatever. But if you have the mapping right, meaning that the configuration files go back to your local computer, you don't lose anything. So the lifetime is as good as you make it. You might not want to keep the configuration. You know, you might be like, hey, I just want my databases in there. I don't care about the configuration. So you're not mapping those. But there's also stuff like high availability. That is something Malcolm, I'm quite sure, can for stuff that has to be available, very well responsive. You know, I don't have any experience with that, but I think there's also stuff like that, how to prioritize the container threads and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, and that was one of the questions that came up actually somewhere in that long list. This is where you get into container orchestration. And so I usually say to people, don't, you know, if you hear about Docker Swarm or Kubernetes or all these other things, don't worry about them at the beginning. Work out Docker, get comfortable with Docker. But if we go back to one of the examples I think used earlier, Holger, where you said, let's say we have a container that has, well, let's say we're building a web app. We've got a container that has our web server in it, and we have another container that has our database in it. It's not that hard in that scenario to make sure we start both containers and have them both running. That's pretty easy. But let's say we want to deal with the situation where our database crashes and we want to have it automatically restart. Yeah. Or maybe we need to handle really serious load. So we actually want to start up 3 copies of the web server and load balance between them, but have them all pointing back to the same database on the back end. Yeah. And set up rules that say, okay, I want to have a minimum of 3 running, but if the CPU load gets above 80%, I want to start up a 4th copy and then shut it down when the CPU load drops back down again. Yeah, all of those sorts of rules, that's where container orchestration comes in. When you've got multiple containers and you want to set up this scenario of how they're all connected and these rules about how many you've got, that's where container orchestration comes in. That's what Kubernetes does. That's what Docker Swarm does. That's what half a dozen others all do. Kubernetes seems to have won that competition. Even Docker seems to be walking away from, well, it depends what week you ask them, but they seem to be walking away from Docker Swarm and Kubernetes. Like even VMware now have a Kubernetes offering, have a Docker offering, which is basically Kubernetes. So be aware that when you want to go into production and you've got big requirements or high availability requirements, then you're probably going to need to get into Kubernetes. But totally, like, don't even learn to spell Kubernetes until you're comfortable with
Exactly.
Docker.
Right.
Just learning how to say it properly is hard enough.
Yeah, I've said it before, so I don't want to get into a discussion about Australian pronunciation versus.
You don't have a pronunciation guide for it. There's actually a pronunciation guide.
I mean, it's super impressive technology, but
Yeah.
it is complicated, and it makes Docker seem like a piece of cake.
Right. And it's even more complicated, if you will. Before you make a final decision, be sure to look what Amazon and Microsoft and Google actually are offering, because they have their own orchestration software pieces, and they tailored it in a way that they can handle what they actually offer behind the scenes. So you may have systems at Amazon's where they can run literally thousands of instances of a single image. So if you need a pool of many web servers, they can do it at Amazon for you, or Microsoft.
I'll tell you something interesting about that. Everybody uses Netflix. It's almost a ubiquitous streaming software now, and that is hosted as a virtual machine on Amazon. And there's a very good article about it. I can't remember the link right now, but a guy did a talk about it where he was saying they made a mistake with some kind of like provisioning system, and he got a phone call or some alert on his phone to say, hey, something's gone wrong, and they'd spun up thousands and thousands and thousands of extra Amazon virtual machines. But that is how your Netflix is delivered to you. What it has is a virtual image that is spun up on demand to stream the various things down to you. So they have like a content delivery network anyway. So it works out where you are on location and doesn't stream a US customer movies from the UK content delivery network, but it is all Amazon based. And yes, they do take all of that traffic, and it's a lot of traffic. We all know, Amazon, I think, streams in up to 4K, but they've got very good auto adjusting technology. So actually they're very clever how they stream it down to you. They can tweak it both based on what you're capable of receiving and also on what the demand is as well, so that they don't burn through too much traffic. But that's all Amazon. Now Microsoft Azure has also got that capability as well, and I think that's Microsoft's big direction. Windows is it's free. Windows 11 is going to be free again for consumers. But of course, if you go to install Docker, it prefers to have a Windows Professional version because the technology for the virtualization is in there. But really, Microsoft is about selling Azure services. They've said as much. You know, they've made it clear that that is how they make their money on the back-end services. So the technology available, we've got some in the links there from Amazon, Microsoft Azure virtualization, and the Amazon AppStream stuff is all about a kind of competing containerization technology for those apps. So if you've got a GUI app, then you can actually containerize it via Azure or via Microsoft, and it could containerize RAD Studio, for example. Theoretically, I don't know whether it actually work in practice, but that's the idea. And we're looking at this kind of containerization technology now so that we can do some of our bigger systems containerized like that. But it's out there. Micro Focus ZenWorks is another one. That was Novell. Everybody remember Novell back in the day? You know, everybody knew Novell. Well, now Micro Focus, I mean, who didn't? Yeah, I've cursed their cabling. Yes, what was it? The
Terminator.
It was like coax cabling, wasn't it? It was horrible.
Yeah, the Terminator.
I'm having PTSD back to the time when they used to have Novell networks everywhere, and someone go, "Oh, my network's not working," and there was some connector that had become disconnected because it was all on one great big rig and things like that. Oh, horrible. But Micro Focus, ZenWorks is another option as well, where it is containerizing a GUI app and will actually stream down GUI. So there are options, but really Docker is about the back end part of it, and really that's where you're probably mostly wanting to I think contain things and have them managed. And you answered a good question that came up, which is what happens about versioning. If you have MySQL, you know, you build your Docker image and it's based on MySQL version 8.0, and they find a big hole in it, a security hole, or some horrible problem where if you hit 1 million records, it corrupts everything and deletes all your data. What happens? How do you get MySQL 8.1 in your Docker images? And I think that's really what you guys were saying, was it's about design, which is that you make sure that your Docker image is providing the engine that makes the rest of your app work rather than be the app. So it's the engine behind the scenes, not the driver of what the app is actually doing. So that when your Docker image spins up, if you've designed it correctly, it will copy in the necessary things in order for your MySQL 8.1 database to work, assuming they're backwardly compatible. Because, you know, it happens, people release breaking changes, and, you know, nothing in life it's as automatic and as repeatable as it can be, but it's a computer. And with the best will in the world, you'll suddenly find that you know, MySQL 8.12 suddenly breaks your app, because that's how it works.
The beauty of Docker is you can easily test it when 8.12 comes out, and easily roll back if it doesn't work, all in seconds. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't remove the requirement for synaptic activity on your part. You still have to think about your application. You know, that technology hasn't come along yet to mean I don't have to worry about stuff. It just means that I can think about it, but then the actual implementation is easier. Yeah, but the thinking is still hard. That's still what you get paid the big dollars for.
I try to avoid thinking. It's not very good for me, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is also emphasizing the most important thing about Docker. Don't try to start with the complicated stuff first. Like, I have to honestly admit, what Malcolm has been talking about Docker orchestration, I have not dealt with that at all. I focused on Docker Compose, Docker files, how I can build my own containers that make my life as a developer easier, and how I can become a better developer by giving customers the opportunity to see my web applications without them having to set up a virtual machine with a database server, with a web server. I literally supply to them the container that they can run on whatever machine they have in the building, because it launches all the different parts. And I'm aware that this only works for the web application part because the user interface is inside, but even for a VCL Windows application, you supply the exe, and the Docker image supplies the server parts on the back end that you need. You don't need to supply a database. You don't need to configure the database server. And all the versioning stuff is completely gone, because you supply the database version, you supply. And it's all about the design, as Malcolm said, of your containers and of your Docker files. That is what makes you a better developer in that way. And that's where you should put your focus in the beginning and not deal with like these scenarios that big companies like Netflix or Amazon or Google have to think about. And if it comes to that point, well, then you can be certain that there is already a solution that you don't have to do that stuff manually, because I would never try to build my own server farm if there is stuff from Microsoft or Amazon available, because the server farm, the financial impact you would always use something that is already readily available.
Yeah. And what Holger is saying, what Holger is saying, Docker simplifies his life as a developer or as a book author or whatever. So, and here comes a question from Roland Kossoff. He basically says that he started using, or if you start using Kubernetes, that this adds some horrible administrative overhead. Of course, if you start using Kubernetes, you are at a different level than just using Docker. You are using Kubernetes not just because it's fun to use it. It's something that should simplify what your final goal is. Your final goal is to deploy the production environment, if you will, the whole staging environment, the whole test and debug environment. So if you have a set of, let's say, 20 different systems, 20 microservices, whatever, and everything has to access a database, maybe 2 or 3 different databases, and you have a set of several dozen systems, it's a mess to do all this manually. And that's where Kubernetes tries to help, because you can automate how, where, and when all these pieces are actually running. So yes, to understand Kubernetes, it takes a lot of time, probably to understand how to configure Kubernetes and to set up everything. But in the end, it should actually help you to achieve what you want to do. Have a running final system, or basically test, staging, and production system. So don't do it if you really don't need it. If you have a simple system, one database, one web server, you probably don't need Kubernetes. So you really have to understand what Kubernetes is for.
Most people that use Kubernetes don't need Kubernetes. They use Kubernetes because it's cool, because it's good on the resume, all of that. You're absolutely right. If you reach a point with any technology, but certainly this, if it's not making your life easier, stop. Yeah. Now, some people that we know use Docker in their development for their databases and stuff like we've talked about, and that's as far as they go, and that's awesome. That's great. They've got value. You can go further than that, but you don't have to. Like, we should get rid of this infrastructure envy. I don't envy the guys who have the need for Kubernetes, because they have the headaches that Kubernetes solves. Right. I don't need that. And there's also, I think, maybe Olaf, someone said before, made a good point, that there's a point in between as well. Like Amazon, Azure, all these guys have managed container services that don't have the complexity of Kubernetes, but give you lots of those benefits. So if you have outgrown just Docker, there's places to go without having to bite the bullet of learning Kubernetes. Yeah, so this can scale up and down, and wherever you stop in that scale, that's totally fine. Move on with your life. This is not about being a Docker guru.
Yeah, it's definitely an important goal to have the ability to reliably deploy and recover from disaster and stuff like that. Those thing, we all know we should have backups, but whether or not you have effective backups or not is another question. And so there's definitely some advantage to make sure that you have, whatever process in place, whether it be just some Docker images or whatever, that you can reliably deploy and reliably recover from backups and deploy to new hardware. But as Malcolm said, don't get infrastructure envy and feel like you have to go all the way down the pipe of all this crazy orchestration if you don't need it. That's a really good point. There's a couple of questions here, and maybe I missed them before their answer before I got here, about operating system compatibility. And as my understanding is, a Linux Docker image runs on Linux and a Windows Docker image runs on Windows, or is that not the case anymore?
Well, depends. Strictly speaking, that's true. But even if you're running a Linux container, on Windows, there's some smoke and mirrors going on under the covers to give it the bits of Linux that it needs in order to run.
What happened for me was when I installed some Linux images, it actually wouldn't let me install the Docker desktop anyway without having WSL2 enabled, Windows System for Linux. And I think that's so that they can just say, oh, you can install any image you like now because you've got Linux on Windows. And so actually, of the images that I'm using at the moment, all of them are Linux, and I'm using Windows 10. It is Windows 10 Professional, but I'm sure it would be probably the same on home, but it is a fully patched Windows 10 with WSL2. It's as I said earlier on, it's the first thing I do is install Windows System for Linux on my PCs, so that because I like Linux, well, I like Unix really, but Linux is good. But yeah, you definitely can run Linux images on Windows. Now, I'm not sure that you can run Windows images on Linux. I don't think that's a doable thing now.
Not really.
No, that's what I thought.
It's like we said before, Docker is basically Linux driven, and you can, of course is something, you can run Linux images on Windows hosts, but of course that's for you as a developer, for you as a test guy, whatever, and you can use your existing Windows machine, install the Linux subsystem so that you can run Docker. But for the real production system or whatever, you would of course not use a Windows system. You would run it on a Linux system, of course. It wouldn't even make sense license-wise. You would have to buy a license for every Windows server. So if you have a Linux server, then, or if you have the need to run centralized Docker images, you would use a Linux server for that, and not, or if you have your own data center in your laundry room and there is already a Windows server, you can of course reuse it to run certain Docker images through Linux subsystem. So if you start from scratch, it's all Linux.
Or Windows containers. I mean, we generally follow the rule that if it's a Windows container in production, it runs on Windows. If it's a Linux container in production, it runs on Linux. In development, this is one of those ironic places where, Windows is actually, the Linux guys will never admit this, but Windows is actually the most flexible development platform for Docker because you can run both Windows and Linux containers. That's the only place you can do that. If you're on Linux or on Mac, you're stuck with just Linux containers. So in development, Windows is awesome. In deployment, stick to the native platform for the container.
Question here. The question came about lifecycle. What about state? Does if my understanding is a Docker image doesn't maintain state when it reboots, it's back to where it started from, right? So if you're running
it depends, the important thing is separate data and the actual software on the image. So you run the server, you can run version 1.2, and if you separated the data by mapping a drive or by always copying a file, which is probably not ideal, because if you copy the file every time, then you have to think about how to persist the actual changes in that file that you probably would make. So map a file, or think about the way how to separate the data from the software is important piece. And if you did that, then you can run any version of the actual software and try how it would perform and how it would well, make differences between versions.
Okay, all right, that's what I thought. Now, we talked about Linux versus Windows Docker versions. If you have a Linux Docker container, is it specific to Red Hat versus Ubuntu, or is it doesn't care what flavor of Linux it is?
I'm Malcolm, maybe yours. You probably have more experience with probably more different versions. I mean, technically, there is no real difference. You can run Ubuntu, you can run very weird Linux versions on it. So I didn't really dig into well, differences or how certain distributions would behave on Docker or not. So
one thing to point out, Olaf, that's something we collaborated a little bit a couple of weeks ago with Xdata, which usually requires a Windows computer to provide web services. And with Delphi having a Linux compiler, you can also compile an Xdata application as a Linux application, and then you can host it inside of a Docker container. And the only thing you need to watch out for is that you use a Linux-based system that supports the glibs that are used for the Delphi compiled application. So you can, for example, very, very famous is the so-called Alpine Linux, which is very, very small. It's only like 5 to 10 megabytes, but that won't work with Delphi because the libraries that are needed are missing. So you have to make sure that it's, for example, if you need to provide a runtime system, which is in Ubuntu, you also need to make sure if you set up your Docker container, you can launch the package installer when your container is being launched, that you install the packages that you need. For example, for Delphi, it's a couple like that provide the libraries so that your executable actually works. That's the only thing to pay attention to. And of course, there's Linux distributions out there which use different, it's not a different kernel, that's not the term, but they're so specifically small that it wouldn't work. So you have to pay attention to that.
It's the CLib libraries that make the difference, right?
Yes, that's the term. Thank you.
So, and to come to a conclusion, Ubuntu works fine. That's the point. So if you want to be sure, just use Ubuntu and you're good.
Something I'm gonna ask you guys actually, if I could, real quick. I did some experiments with the new Apple M1 ARM computer, and the question came up about whether or not you can run. So the both Windows and Mac OS have translation layers, so they can run x86 code on the ARM OS. But the question came up whether or not you can run a actual ARM or actual x86 OS in a virtual machine. And I was looking at QEMU. Have any of you used QEMU as far as being able to use that to virtualize the CPU itself?
Not used, but from what I read is it works, but it's slow. It's really slow. It's more like an experiment. It's not really something you would use for anything meaningful.
Oh, Jim's camera's just gone blank.
Oh, you just migrated.
There he is. He's back. Yeah,
that's
I'm back.
Yeah. Did you get beamed up somewhere?
Weird. All right.
If you don't pay attention, they can beam you back up to your home planet. That happens.
Yes.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been saying, "Oh, it's a really great session," and I always say to people, you know what? I learn as much coming on these talks as you know, people viewing, and I've used Docker and some other technologies, and we're actually doing a hybrid cloud system at the moment, so it's a very relevant conversation for us. The problem I've had with the cloud solution that these people are trying to produce is getting non-technical people to understand how it works. Because they understand virtual machines, so they're good with that. They understand remote desktop, they're good with that. But trying to say to them that you're actually taking a very small part of the system and turning that into a virtual machine and then it runs on something else is, it seems like a bit of a bridge too far for them. And they're not stupid people, they're just not highly technical. And the biggest barrier to sale, and it's not sale, but you know, the biggest barrier to adoption is trying to get people to get their heads around how it works, because if you point them to the Docker site, that's the end of it, because they're just straight over their head. They don't get a thing about it. And I haven't really found a good metaphor for how it works. All I really say is it's like a black box. It's almost like you plug the black box into your network and out comes our back-end server programs, and that's how I explain it to them, that it just happens to need somewhere to live, and that's a server. But apart from that, it's a software black box, and off it goes. It works. But you know, they're much more comfortable with having virtual machines and remote desktoping in, and we'll give people remote desktops. And this is just such a really clunky solution when you've got something like Docker, which will just make the thing work, you know, for the back end of it, and they can still have the fat clients installed on their PCs if that's what they really want. You know, but I guess as I said, I learned as much coming on these as anything else. It's great.
I guess, you know, every customer's at a different point in their kind of technology. You know, some people we run into are still trying to get their heads around VMs. So, you know, it just depends. I've got one customer I know who they're very comfortable with VMs, and they are using Docker now, and the developers know it, so that's all fine. But the head of sales, who has to go out and sell this product and explain the architecture at a super high level, he in his mind, Docker are just slim VMs, and that's enough.
In they are.
Yeah, and that's enough for him. He can run with that metaphor and do his job and sell them, and it's not technically accurate, but who cares? He understands it now. So I think everyone's just got to find their metaphor or their way of being happy with it, and then move on with their lives. Because ultimately, who actually cares about most people?
The system works and we can sell it.
Exactly. Outside of this webinar, probably most people don't actually care what Docker is, which is fine. It's only weird people.
Well, you know, we've got links up on the screen to all sorts of other competing technologies, and we talked a lot about Docker, but in the webinar we have talked about other options as well. And the links I've got up at the moment on the screen are the ones for the playlist to do specifically with the Rad Studio MPA server stuff.
Actually,
because,
I think let me change. I think I switched it that I was not sharing.
Oh, yes, you did that sneakily. It didn't even warn me. See? Yes.
There you go. Now you're sharing your screen again.
Okay. Oh, well, let me show that screen. Always have to make sure I share the right screen, because one of them's got all my messages on. Yes, I mean, the links we've got up, I did show lots of links. These are the ones of the YouTube videos. They're only the slides, Jim. So actually anybody that's on the webinar at the moment, we always have our traditional question at the beginning, which is this being recorded? Yes. Will the slides be available? Yes. Will I be able to see the replays? Yes. We will make sure that they are in Embarcadero social media and on the blogs.embarcadero.com as well, and learndelphi.com and a few others as well, so .org. So the answer is, don't worry, we will make sure you get well and truly oiled up on all the right information. The other link that other set of links was this one as well. So we've had quite a few things come up. We're getting towards England versus with Denmark time, where
3 minutes, Ian. 3 minutes.
Yeah. England are going to beat Denmark. That's my prediction, and then we're going to be in the final, and there's going to be all of England will be terribly, terribly inebriated and then hung over the following day
As
come
you
the
said,
day of
Ian,
the
just
final.
dreams and reality.
Oh, sorry, who beat Germany again?
All right, let's wrap up. Let's wrap up, Ian. Let's wrap up. So I'm going to reiterate what Ian was saying, though, is I love these because it's a chance for me to come on and talk with, MVPs and other experts, and just really, I also learn a lot every time, and I like these as being a kind of a casual conversation. We get together and talk about these technologies and figure out what we need to understand. I do want to go around real quick. So actually download the slides if you haven't. I'll make sure they're up on there with the YouTube replay as well. And if you do have any questions beyond the scope of what we talked about today, I believe most of the MVPs available for consulting as well. You can certainly hire them for a few hours to get some more help with things and move your projects forward. But real quick, just go around. Malcolm, anything you want to say before we go?
Just one quick one. Can you just flick back, Ian? Can you just flick back to that YouTube slide? I said before, I was saying to people that they should start small and just start with the basic things of, running a database or whatever. That first YouTube link there, Docker for Delphi, that's a playlist that has a bunch of kind of bite-sized YouTube videos walking you through exactly that, from creating your first Hello World Docker image through to spinning up different versions of databases, spinning up Apache, all that kind of stuff. So go there, and you'll have to put up with my accent, but otherwise, hopefully it's useful.
Great. Holger, anything you wanted to add real quick before we wrap up?
Yeah, only again, the advice, start slow, start with a simple container. Don't start with the Microsoft SQL Server container right from the start, which has like 300 configuration options. Start with a web server and go from there. And I think that's exactly what Malcolm does in the videos. And I literally looked at a couple of those in order to dig deeper with a focus on Delphi, because there's lots of literature out there for Docker, but this YouTube series gives you the view on things as a Delphi developer.
Yeah. And then Olaf, anything you want to say real quick, wrap up?
Well, for the German-speaking people in the audience, Holger and I will be doing a Code Rage session in September, and we will do a practical example how to set up Docker and images and how to compile for Linux with Delphi and all this kind of stuff. So I think it has not been announced yet, but it's going to be September. So watch closely on the Embarcadero site.
It's going to be in German language, of course.
Yeah, of course. It's the German Code Rage.
Before you run off to watch your game.
England can beat Denmark, yes. Yeah, nothing really to add from me. And thanks everybody for coming along. We like doing these sessions because it's a relaxed chat rather than a look at what we can do and demonstrate things. We find it useful to talk to other people on the chat. And so I appreciate people asking questions, even the ones we don't know the answers to, because it gives us some idea of maybe things we should look at and learn as well. All of us are still learning. I'm sure that's the case.
Yeah. All right. Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And thank you to our panelists for being part of this and for sharing your expertise with us and everything. So take care, everybody. And we'll catch you all next time. Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.